Hi, my name is Yasmin Tarehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, consciousness, and spirituality. On today's episode, we're going to have a conversation that's a little different. I'll be speaking with Gabriel Shipton, the brother of the renowned journalist Julian Assange, and he's a passionate advocate for environmental protection, human rights, and press freedom. And, growing up in a family deeply committed to these values, Gabriel was inspired to dedicate his life to making a positive impact on the world. And he's been really dedicating his time to really on the Julian case entirely. And he's a film producer. He's a producer of the film Ithaka and Fara, which dives into mental health issues. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Gabriel.
Thanks, Yasmin. It's good to be with you.
So to kick it off, Gabriel, for a lot of people who are listening to this, there might be a lot of maybe unfamiliar folks, in the Julian Assange case. And so I'd love to kind of zoom out and talk a little bit about what inspired Julian to found WikiLeaks and what were maybe some of his goals when creating the organization. And maybe you can also explain what WikiLeaks is for those who are listening.
Well, WikiLeaks was started back in 2006, and it was really started as a sort of whistleblowing platform. It was things were changing with whistleblowing, with getting these large data dumps and people's footprints online. And Julian really identified that as a problem for whistleblowers, is that increasingly people were tracked. They were, having trouble sort of dealing with their digital footprint when it came to whistleblowing. And so Julian identified that and really developed, encryption and sort of used the architecture of the internet to develop a website made for whistleblowers, to protect their identity, so that they could submit original documentation to WikiLeaks, and those documents be present online for reporters to see, but also for us to see. And I think Julian's real motivation behind this was, how do I he's a technologist. He's has a long history of using technology and developing technology way back in to the 90s. Types of encryption, really at the forefront of that, a cypherpunk they're called. And so Julian back then wanted to use his skills in this new sort of digital world to increase justice for everyone. And he identified information as being able to do that access to information for us was key, and accessing correct, truthful information would let us make better decisions about our societies and how we can better ourselves, because what we saw and what Julian saw was during the war in Iraq and the lead up to the war in Iraq, the complicity of the mainstream media in the one of the biggest lies in the mainstream media, which was the weapons of mass destruction. The media brought up this and really sold to the public the war in Iraq through this big lie about the weapons of mass destruction that were present there that weren't really there. And so I think Julian really identified at that time, well, what is the counterbalance to these large legacy media organizations? How can we as people, or we as a society, deal with these lies and get people more truth, so that we can actually make proper decisions that affect everybody, like going to war. And so that's really where sort of how WikiLeaks came about, and Julian using his skills as a cryptographer, as a technologist, to build this website that was not only very private for leakers, but also totally uncensorable. So Julian had this unique understanding of the architecture of the internet to be able to create a site that could not be censored by any government. It's still online to this day, WikiLeaks, even though Julian's come under some serious attacks, and the website has come under very, very serious attack, unprecedented attack, really. It's managed to keep its archive online so that people can still refer to it, can still read it. It's one of the most cited websites in academia and in journalism of all time. So being able to keep it up and keep it going was also part of Julian's unique ability to use the architecture of the internet, but also this jurisdictional arbitrage. So jurisdictional arbitrage in the sense that finding jurisdictions around the world or different places that had really strong journalistic protection, strong free speech protection, and using those to keep the website going and online. But I think one of the main things and one of the main results from the website or WikiLeaks was really, for a long time, these leaks existed, and we as people would consume them through these media corporations. The New York Times, say, would get a leak from a source, and they would present it to us in a curated way. We would never actually see the original documentation related to the leak, but we would see the New York Times reporting on it. And so it always comes through this sort of corporate media prism where we, as readers or as consumers of this material, would have to sort of rely on this media organization to be telling us the truth. But the idea with WikiLeaks was that the full document is present online for everyone to see. And so Julian coined this phrase, scientific journalism. So similarly, as was with a scientific paper, it was peer reviewed. You had the data. You were able to review the paper yourself. So Julian presented this new form of journalism, scientific journalism, where you as a reader could have the leaked material in front of you and also the reporting. And so you could see exactly where the bias in the reporting was or what was omitted in the reporting. But it also gave leakers more inspiration, I guess, to leak, knowing that the information that they leak would have a bigger impact. More people would see the information. There would be more reporting on the information because it wasn't stuck with one organization, and that documents that could impact different countries all around the world were shared with journalists so they could report on them all at the same time. And we saw that that sort of really took off with WikiLeaks in 2010, 2011, when they started publishing the Chelsea Manning leaks. And these Chelsea Manning leaks were a vast trove of documents related to the Afghanistan war, the war in Iraq, Guantanamo Bay detainee files, which exposed torture that was going on at Guantanamo, as well as 250,000 diplomatic cables from the US State Department. And so it was at this time that these sort of large data leaks really came to the fore, and WikiLeaks was at the forefront of that. And, they were the pioneers in putting these leaks out and establishing these collaborations between media organizations all around the world to publish simultaneously for maximum effect.
Wow. So just to unpack so much of that, thank you so much for sharing the genesis story of WikiLeaks and some of the most kind of startling discoveries. I want to double click on, I think the big question right now before we go into, the case itself and where it's at right now, at the time is like, there's like this balance between, what are the broader implications for his case for press freedom, the protection of journalists and whistleblowers, and the inquiry of like, well, why do we live in a society in which we have to withhold information and allow the governments to have, files and secrets really from the greater public. Now, the defense really that's been playing out for so long was it's all based on national security, on defense. So I'm curious, like, how do you reconcile those two, I would say, polarities, really? Why don't you just tell me what you think about those two polarities and why I think society has had a difficult time reconciling them?
Well, I think from my perspective, or I mean, I'm not in government. I'm just an average citizen. I'm a filmmaker. I'm a storyteller, and I think we all sort of, in our societies, there's different roles for different people. The role of a journalist is to inform people about what's going on. What's going on with their governments, so that they can make decisions, so that we as voters or participants in self-governance can make decisions about that benefit us, that benefit our children, and the future of our nations and our societies. So if we aren't informed about what's going on, if we are kept ignorant, and are sort of ruled in by a secret conspiracy of government, corporation, and media, then I think it does lead to the sort of crumbling of the fabric of the sort of fabric of our society. We become an ignorant many, and a sort of a few that are ruling over us, and I don't think that's not really anyone's great idea of a good society to be a part of, really. So I think there are different roles, and those roles have an interplay between them, and sort of they're antagonistic in a sense. That the government or governments and people in power, they tend towards secrecy. They tend toward hiding their mistakes, and if that is allowed to keep going and keep progressing, then they won't reveal anything. And that's why the role of journalism and freedom of speech and freedom of expression is so important, because it's a check. It's a check on that power, and because power will act to protect itself at all times, and having that such an important check in place through journalism, through that freedom of expression, and also free. I think free speech is often people often. We sort of look at free speech in isolation, that, it's our freedom to speak. But, if you're on the moon and you've got free speech, what does it matter? I think it's really freedom of communication, so that it's two-sided. We have freedom to speak, but people also have freedom to listen and to understand. And so I think that's often glossed over, and I think very important in the free speech conversation. It's not just being able to speak, but it's being able to communicate and understand that speech. That is very important for us. So yeah, I think there is always going to be that interplay that states, governments do require secrets, but they also need that check. because otherwise they always tend to cover up their own crimes. And that's exactly what Julian and WikiLeaks really exposed here. It was civilian deaths, unreported civilian deaths in Iraq through these Iraq war files, tens of thousands of unreported civilian deaths. And those civilian deaths weren't reported because the people who, the military-industrial complex and the government at the time didn't want us as the population to think that this war was going badly, that there was a high human cost to this war. And so they hid those deaths from us, and which sort of allowed them to continue on fighting and continue on making this representation that the war was a successful war, when in fact it was very deadly. And the way that they were fighting it led to all these excess deaths. And another great example from these files is the most famous, probably the most famous release by WikiLeaks, is the collateral murder video, which the anniversary is actually coming up on the 4th of April of the release of that video. And what that video shows is a helicopter gunship in Iraq, in Baghdad, and that helicopter gunship uses its weapons of war against unarmed civilians on the streets of Baghdad. And those civilians included two Reuters journalists, Reuters photojournalists. And so it was for the very first time that we had an understanding of what it was like, what the perspective of the soldiers there was, and how these weapons of war were being used against civilians there. And so it sort of lifted this veil, and that video was evidence of a war crime, evidence of these these deaths, this use of a helicopter gunship to kill these civilians, and then also kill the people who came to give them assistance, came to pick them up and take them to the hospital. Their van was also lit up, as they say in the video, and there was children inside that van as well. So that video was kept under wraps and hidden from us, and so that crime remained hidden until Julian and WikiLeaks exposed us. So I think there's direct evidence there of how national security, how document classification is often used to hide crimes, not just to hide secrets that states actually need, but also to hide crimes that state criminality that the states commit.
Right. And when a government, like you said, commits a crime, like there really is no check right now, and there's just a lot for us to sort of sit and trust and hope that things are done with a level of morality and consciousness. But, I think a government can only be as good as the level of consciousness that the people who are in power are at. I find this very actually deeply personal because I don't think we've talked about this, but I'm actually Iraqi American. So when I was, growing up, I definitely saw and heard, firsthand about all the civilian lives that were taken during the wars, and it was really difficult to share a different perspective. And so I think it is important for a level of truth to emerge that is not, especially given just the level of secrecy that we've had with government for so long. We just are in a state of kind of darkness, and it does feel very one-sided. So, and again, I'm not an expert in this field, but it does feel, that in many cases, like, we just have to trust. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is that our trust largely has been eroded. And I want to talk a little bit about what your thoughts are on these, like, the broader implications of his case for press freedom. And maybe you could walk us through the last, let's say, like, what was it, 14 years or so from, Ecuador to London. Like, can you walk us through the journey of what has actually played out with Julian and where we're at now with the case?
Well, so these leaks that I was talking about, the Chelsea Manning leaks that started to be released in 2010 and continued on into 2011, that's when the attacks on WikiLeaks really began in earnest. When these releases began, there was an extra legal banking blockade. That was one of the first things that happened. So WikiLeaks functioned. It's a non-profit organization. Its sole income was from its donors. So it had its money shut off by an extra legal banking blockade. So they closed the PayPal of WikiLeaks. The MasterCard and Visa cut off donations to WikiLeaks. They had their bank accounts closed. And Julian even had his personal bank accounts shut down at that time. And so this was the sort of first step, first reaction from these powers that WikiLeaks had exposed, was to, okay, let's cut the money off. And then that's when the other sort of attacks started to really develop around Julian. He was at the time, in Sweden, and there were some sexual allegations against him, and he was went in for questioning at the Swedish police, and this was at the same time they were publishing this information. And the Swedish police questioned him, and they said, "Okay, you're free to go." And they closed the investigation down and said, "Okay, you can leave the country." And so Julian then left Sweden to the United Kingdom, where he was invited by the Guardian newspaper to work with them on continuing the release and do a presentation there. And while he was on the plane, the Swedish police reopened the investigation. And actually, he got off the plane in the UK to find out that an Interpol red notice had been issued for his arrest. An Interpol red notice is that it's a sort of European Union alert that sends out to all the police stations that you're a wanted person, and that was in relation to this investigation in Sweden. And at that time, he got off the plane, and all his baggage went missing, and there were actually leaks on there, leaks of massacres actually that have never been published because his bags, etc., all went missing during that flight. And so it was really then that these regulatory and legal attacks really ramped up against Julian. He then began to fight extradition to Sweden. He was always adamant that there was the real threat of a extradition to the United States that was waiting in the wings. And he initially went to prison in the UK for a 6 months period in relation to this extradition request, and then eventually fought it through the courts. He spent 2 years in house arrest, and he fought this extradition request all the way to the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, where he eventually lost. And so they were going to extradite him to Sweden for questioning. Keep in mind, he was never actually charged in Sweden. It was always a preliminary investigation. It's actually the longest preliminary investigation in Swedish history. It went for seven or so years, and they eventually dropped it because of the lack of evidence that they had. But when he lost in the Supreme Court that extradition fight, he then sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And then that's just a small 2-bedroom flat. It's in Knightsbridge, just near Harrods. And he ended up spending 7 years inside that embassy. Ecuador granted him asylum in the embassy based on that threat of persecution by the United States. And they eventually granted him citizenship there as well. And he was able to keep WikiLeaks running from that embassy. They continued publishing material. They published, Vault 7 CIA leaks in 2017. They published troves of intelligence information from private intelligence companies, Stratfor. They published information about toxic waste dumping off the coast of Africa, and they kept publishing information, even though Julian was stuck inside this small embassy. They were able to keep their organization running despite all the hurdles that were thrown up in front of them. And it was when Julian published this Vault 7 CIA leaks, and that Vault 7 leak was related to CIA hacking tools, how the CIA could hack into your phone, turn it into a listening device, your TVs at home, your Samsung TV, how the CIA had tools to turn that into a listening device, even if the TV was off. They could get into it and listen to your conversations and make recordings through those internet-connected household appliances that we have. But I think what was more embarrassing to the CIA at the time was that they'd actually lost control of these hacking tools, that they were actually out in the wild, circulating on the dark web and available for anyone to use. And they hadn't revealed that before. And at that time, that embarrassed Mike Pompeo, who was then head of the CIA, embarrassed him immensely. And he came out and, as his first speech as CIA director, basically issued this edict that he was going to make it his priority to pursue Julian Assange and to pursue WikiLeaks, and that he would use every method at his disposal as head of the CIA to really pursue Julian and WikiLeaks. And it was at that time in the Ecuadorian embassy where the security company that was supposed to be protecting Julian in the embassy was then co-opted by the CIA, and they started to monitor Julian, monitor his guests. They installed high-definition cameras throughout the embassy, as well as microphones. And that's when really Julian's refuge, the Ecuadorian embassy, turned into his prison. In more, actually, it was worse than a prison for Julian, because what we later found out was not only were they recording his meetings with his lawyers, his doctors, and anybody who entered, but there was also plots that were sketches that were drawn up within the CIA to murder Julian, and plots that made it all the way to the Trump White House to kidnap him. And we know this from reporting from 3 Washington, D.C. reporters who did an in-depth investigation and cited 30 former, current intelligence community sources that confirmed this information, that there were plots to kidnap Julian that made it as high as the Trump administration. And it was really Mike Pompeo going off the deep end here. And what happened, the conversation that was reported was that this plot to kidnap Julian went all the way to the White House, and then the DOJ representatives, the Department of Justice representatives at this meeting, said to Pompeo, well, what are you going to do with him once you kidnap him? You can't just take him from the embassy and put him in a black site in Guantanamo or somewhere like that. You just wait and we'll get some charges together, and then you can take him from the embassy. So we can really track the timeline of how this current prosecution really came to be. And it was during that era, that Pompeo era of state, where he was Secretary of State and Director of CIA. And it was in 2019 that this unprecedented indictment was revealed, and Julian was taken from the Ecuadorian embassy. He was arrested from the Ecuadorian embassy by British police. One of the first times in history the police were allowed in an embassy to arrest somebody, and they took him, and that's when this indictment, was revealed, and it was this unprecedented Espionage Act indictment. It's 17 charges under the Espionage Act, which is a 1970 US law that was actually put in place to quell dissent during the First World War, and it's never been used in this way before. Usually, the Espionage Act is used against government employees who leak information, and those Espionage Act prosecutions really ramped up under the Obama administration and continued under the Trump administration. And people like Edward Snowden, he'd be charged under the Espionage Act. Chelsea Manning was charged under the Espionage Act and convicted and sentenced to 35 years in prison for leaking that information to WikiLeaks. But this is the first time it's been used against a publisher. They tried to use it before against the New York Times and the Washington Post in 1978, I believe, when they were publishing the Pentagon Papers that Daniel Ellsberg famously leaked about the Vietnam War. But there was a Supreme Court ruling that said that you couldn't use this against a publisher, that it was in violation of their First Amendment rights. So this prosecution is actually winding back that Pentagon Papers precedent of 1978. And the effect that it is having is really a huge chilling effect on national security journalism, in that any publisher around the world who has classified material from the United States government and wishes to publish it now has this threat hanging over them, that they will have an Espionage Act prosecution waiting for them if they publish this information that upsets those people in power.
Wow. So a lot is at stake here. And, I think journalists everywhere are probably very terrified at this news. So I want to talk a little bit about where his case is at now and, what's at stake, given this is also an election year in the United States. What you obviously visit with Julian often, what's going on in his own internal world, if you can share, and what's kind of going on right now with the extradition claims for him to get extradited back to the U.S. I know that it's been on pause, and by the time we release this, it'll be a week later. But right now, where is the case at?
Well, he's been fighting this extradition since 2019, and that whole time he's been kept in a maximum security prison just outside of London. It's a prison called Belmarsh. It's actually built for the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, but now it's used for the most violent, Britain's basically most violent, terrorists are in there as well. And Julian has been kept there for the last 5 years while he's been fighting this extradition. He's not charged with anything in the United Kingdom. He's not serving a sentence. He's been kept there solely at the request of the US DOJ. And I think this really speaks to that chilling effect as well that I was talking about, in the sense that it's not only a chilling effect in the United States, but also all over the world, that the US DOJ can reach into any country and use its secrecy laws to keep somebody who publishes things they don't like in prison almost indefinitely. And that is really, really scary, because what we've seen happening is it's sort of this global race to the bottom, if you will, in relation to press freedom. The example has been set here with Julian, that this is how you do it. You use your secrecy law. If somebody publishes something you don't like, use your secrecy laws and keep them in prison for as long as you like. And we see that happening more and more in places in other countries in the world, like Russia or China. We've got Evan Gershkovich, a Wall Street Journal journalist who's imprisoned in Russia. There's many Australian journalists who are been imprisoned in China, who are being charged under their espionage under their espionage laws for publishing information that the Chinese government doesn't like. So the US is really leading the charge when it comes to attacks on journalists and publishers around the world. But as far as where we're up to in Julian's case, he has one final legal avenue left to him in the United Kingdom, where we are now waiting. 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, he had a 2-day hearing where judges heard his application to appeal over 2 days in London in late February, actually. And they've now come back and said, yes, we will grant appeal. There are worthy points. One point being that the prosecutors refused to rule out the death penalty if Julian was extradited to the United States, and Britain doesn't allow extradition for capital punishment, and that Julian should be guaranteed freedom of expression and First Amendment rights, and that he shouldn't be discriminated against because he's not an American citizen. He's actually Australian. And so, but what the courts have done in a sort of first of its kind, it's never been done before in the United Kingdom, is they've said to the United States government, we have these 2 points of appeal that we think are worthy, but we're not quite going to approve the appeal. We're going to hit the ball back to the US DOJ and give them an opportunity to address these concerns in a diplomatic way. So give a diplomatic note saying things like, "Oh yes, we assure that Julian will not receive the death penalty and that he will have his First Amendment rights respected." So that is very unusual for the courts to do that. And what we've seen in the past is the courts take these sort of notes on face value, not actually interrogate them at all, but also that they are routinely broken. These assurances are routinely broken once the person arrives on US shores. All bets are off in that sense, and there's no way for the UK courts to enforce them once Julian's extradited. So we're seeing this sort of setup now for Julian, which is coming on the 20th of May, this sort of ticking clock where his extradition is becoming more and more likely, and that he'll be put on a plane, on the 20th of May to be taken to the Eastern District of Virginia, which is where the indictment emanates from, to be tried there. But I think what has been, over these years advocating for Julian, we've seen a real upwelling of support for him and concern from everyday people, but also world leaders, institutions, non-government institutions, NGOs, parliaments around the world, have all come out calling on the Biden administration to bring this to an end because of the threat that it poses to journalists in their countries, but also press freedom in the United States. So in the US, essentially all of the largest press freedom organizations, ACLU, Freedom of the Press Foundation, human rights foundations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, have written multiple letters to the Biden administration calling on them to bring this prosecution to a close, to drop the charges, in fact, because of the threat that they pose to press freedoms. The New York Times last year even wrote a letter to the Biden administration, calling on them to drop these charges because of the threat that it poses to the New York Times. And they wrote that in collaboration with El País in Spain, Le Monde in France, The Guardian in the United Kingdom, and Der Spiegel in Germany. So a worldwide coalition of newspapers, the biggest newspapers all around the world, wrote to the Biden administration calling on them to drop this. We've also seen the Australian Parliament, who just in February, just before the hearing, passed a motion, 3/4 of the Parliament supporting the motion, calling on the UK and the US to let Julian go and bring him back home. And just a few weeks ago, the German Chancellor, Chancellor Scholz, called on the UK not to extradite Julian to the US because of the torturous prison conditions that he would likely face there. So this is a real political hot potato for the Biden administration. It's a scandalous prosecution, and it's seen that way around the world by world leaders, as I just outlined. And there is a real political cost to this prosecution for the Biden administration. And as you mentioned, there's an election. It's an election season, and can you imagine a journalist arriving on US shores in shackles during the lead up to an election? I think it's not an image that the Biden administration would necessarily want plastered on the front of the New York Times.
Right. Wow. So, Gabriel, I also want to, talk a little bit about the human element of this whole journey. You are his brother. So I'm really curious, what this has been like for you for the last 14 years. And I mean, it just has seemed like such a roller coaster. And I'm curious how you and your family and how his wife have been coping, and, what sort of emotions have been at play here.
Well, luckily, we're all pretty, stoic type people. When we don't, we sort of focus on, what can we do, and what can be done, rather than throwing our hands in the air and pulling the blanket over our heads and hoping that everything will be okay. We're always more, as a family, we're united and active in that sense. Our family conversations are always about, what can we do next? Who should I speak to? Or, what are we going to do when this happens? It's always it's a continual, strategy type discussion, when we get together as a family. But in terms of, our family's been torn apart in a sense. Julian's been stuck in the United Kingdom for 13 years now. So, he's an Australian, and he's got 2 small children there in the United Kingdom. My nephews, 5 and 6-year-old children, 2 boys, Gabriel and Max, and they've only known Julian as in that prison. They've never known him anywhere else. They've never experienced having a father who's been out of prison. They call the prison daddy's house. And I'm always amazed, like when you explain this to when you explain this to children, they sort of have a better understanding of it than a lot of adults do. That they understand that some Julians in jail for telling the truth, and they don't bring in all these other arguments that are often used for imprisoning Julian. For them, it's very simple. As things are for children, which I'm always astonished that my daughter, who's 10, is able to explain like succinctly to her friends that Julian actually didn't do anything wrong, and that he's in jail for telling the truth, and she's really good at that. And I think that always amazes me about our family and how how these kids interpret it and understand it. But I went to see, when I last saw Julian at the end of February in the prison, and he's this is really grinding him down. It's taking its toll on his body, on his mind. It's really heartbreaking to see. He's my older brother. I've always looked up to him and what he's been able to do in the world, and he's a historical figure now, and seeing him in the condition that he's in is, it's absolutely heartbreaking for me. I mean, he's hanging in there and he's still fighting, but we don't know how much juice he's got left. Like how much longer this can go on. In 2019, the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, Niels Melzer, actually went to see Julian and took 2 independent doctors there with him, who usually go, they don't usually go to countries like the United Kingdom to assess torture victims. They're usually, going to these sort of third world authoritarian states and going into those sorts of prisons. But they went to see Julian, and their independent assessment was that Julian was suffering the effects of psychological torture. And Niels Melzer actually called it slow motion murder before our eyes. And so if you can imagine what it's like, to watch your family member be slowly murdered over a number of years, it's heartbreaking, but we all stick together, and we try and turn that into action and turn that into activity. Because I've spoken to a lot of political prisoners, and they always say that what kept them going on the inside was knowing that there were people out there fighting for them. And so part of our mission as Julian's family is to keep that going, to keep Julian going by letting him know that we're out here, not forgetting about him, that we're fighting for him. We're fighting for the principles that he stood for and stands for, those principles of freedom of speech, freedom of communication, and that the support for him is growing all around the world.
Beautiful. Oh, that's so moving. And, I just want to say that my heart is with you all. I can't imagine experiencing that journey. And it just sounds like you have all handled it with such grace. So, I'm curious, Gabriel, looking back on the last, 13, 14 years or so, on how things have played out. What sort of things have surprised you the most on this journey?
Oh, I've made so many friends, on this journey. What we're doing wouldn't be possible without the generosity of others, and that's always amazed me, is that as much as Julian has been demonized and maligned, and in the media over the years, the attacks on him have been absolutely ceaseless. There are good people out there who want to help and want to do things. They want to support us. They have us in their homes when we're traveling around. I'm always amazed by the generosity of the souls of the people who are out there, who understand what's going on, and are fighting for Julian and supporting our mission. That's and you find them in unlikely places, unlikely people, unlikely coalitions. I often say that this issue we bring people from different political segments together on this issue, from left and right, and we always find allies in unlikely places. So we've got people like AOC supporting us, as well as Marjorie Taylor Greene in the US Congress. So if these two sorts of people can come together on an issue like this, then I think anything's possible.
So, Gabriel, what do you want to tell our listeners about, like the overarching message or call to action? Like, what's the main takeaway from this conversation? What do you want our audience to be doing or thinking about or reflecting about? And it could just be about freedom of speech. It could be about national security journalism. But I'm just curious, what's sort of your call to action?
Well, in terms of a specific call to action, we're always encouraging people to contact their representatives, and we've got a resolution before the House, before the Congress at the moment. So that's one way your US listeners can get involved is contact their representative, ask them to sign on House Resolution 934, which is it's a calling for Julian's freedom. It's got, I think, 11 co-sponsors at the moment. But I think fighting for liberty, fighting for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, it needs to be a constant thing. It's not something that the people in power will give to us. We have to fight for it. And so I think that the day that we become the day that we stop caring about it is the day that it's taken away from us, and we won't be able to use it anymore. So I think it's something constant that people need to contribute to, and keep exercising their freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Otherwise, it'll get taken away.
And what do you think the future holds? For whistleblowers, folks who are in the art of whistleblowing in general. Like, what do you think is going to play out over the next 5-10 years going forward?
Well, I mean, it's pretty bleak. It's pretty bleak. I think, we're going to see this progression now of, I think with the development of AI and this sort of they're almost states unto themselves, Google, Microsoft, these ways that we now interact every day with each other through these digital devices. If you combine that with AI, I think the methods of control are going to become more and more nuanced. We're not going to understand really what we're fighting back against because we don't actually understand it or even see that it actually exists. I mean, and so I think the fight that we're in at the moment it needs to be ramped up, and because soon, or it's almost actually upon us, that the understanding of the ways that we're manipulated is going to be out of our grasp.
Yes. Yep. Yes, I could not agree more. And so, just for those listening, are there any resources that you can point folks to in order to sort of take action? So you said House Resolution 934. So for those who live in the U.S., you can call your representatives. Is there anything else from a global perspective that people can do? Write the administration?
Yeah, so we've got, if you jump on to action.assangecampaign.org, that's action.assangecampaign.org. You can fill in your information there. There's a petition there, and once you sign the petition, you'll go on our mailing list, and we can keep in touch with you. We've got a growing community all around the world that we always in touch with through email. updating them on what's going on and giving them good information about the case, as well as current actions that we're working on. So that would be the main start for listeners, I'd say, is going to action.assangecampaign.org.au.
Amazing. And we'll leave the link in the show notes so that people can find it. So thank you so much for your time, Gabriel. This was very illuminating. I think for a lot of people listening, they're going to have a lot to think about and ruminate about on this whole case. And yeah, I'm just so grateful for your time and taking the time to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Yasmin. Thank you.
Awesome. And for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about the Julian Assange case with his brother, Gabriel Shipton. And we also learned about national security journalism. And you can tune in to Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in consciousness, wellness, and well-being. Thank you so much.